This is Jim Bish with the Americans in Wartime Museum, and today is March 28, 2019, and I'm conducting an interview with Jimmy Smith in Sun City, Arizona. Jimmy, could you please give me your full name and where you were born?
It's Jimmy Burness Smith, and I was born in Allen, Oklahoma.
And what war or wars did you participate in?
I participated in the Vietnam War.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned you were from Oklahoma. Did you grow up in Oklahoma then?
Yes, I was born and raised on a small farm in Oklahoma, went through high school there, and after graduating from high school, I went to California.
Okay. And how did you find your way into the service of our country?
Well, in 1954, I joined the National Guard in Allen, Oklahoma. It was an infantry unit, and I served as an infantryman for the 2 years, and then I transferred to artillery when I went to California.
Okay. And that was in 1954, 55, in that time frame when you were...
1954, 55, and part of 56.
Okay. And so you were with the California National Guard?
Yes, I was with an artillery unit for about 2 years, and then I was with an aviation unit for several years.
Okay. And did the National Guard ever become activated, or did your service in there? How did you find your way into the regular service?
Well, I was an enlisted man, and I was an E5 when I went to California, and I gained rank up through E7. But I was in an aviation outfit, and I decided I would like to be a helicopter pilot. So I went to California Military Academy for a year and was commissioned as second lieutenant. I was now in the unit as in a flight slot, but they were not taking anyone in for flight training because of the demand for Vietnam. In 1968, though, I volunteered to go on active duty and go to flight school and go to Vietnam.
Okay. So where did you go to flight school at?
Fort Rucker, Alabama.
Okay. And this was in 1968.
1968.
By 1968, the Vietnam War was pretty heated.
Yes,
Tet Offensive occurred in January of '68, and that we reached our peak as far as military personnel in 1968 as well. After you left flight school, where did you end up? Where did you go to?
Right after flight school, they sent me to an aircraft maintenance officer's course at Fort Eustis, Virginia, and I was trained as a maintenance test pilot. And then I went to Vietnam, and of course when I went there I served as a maintenance test pilot for helicopters.
And your service in Vietnam was during 1969 then?
1969 and part of 1970.
Do you remember your flight over there? How did you make it over to Vietnam? What route did you take?
I flew from Travis Air Force Base straight into Vietnam. I flew into Bien Hoa in Vietnam, and we offloaded there, and then they assigned us to different units. And in the middle of the night, I flew down to 4 Corps, which was Vinh Long, Vietnam, and that's where I was assigned.
What was your military occupational specialty?
Well, I was an aircraft maintenance officer.
That's what you were, aircraft maintenance officer? And is that pretty much what the job you were doing over there?
I did that totally in Vietnam, although I did fly quite a bit of combat because of need for pilots, because of the number of hours we flew there. I would go to the area of operations at least once a week, and I usually flew with the gun platoon, the H-1G Cobra, and I was what we called the bullet catcher. I was the gunner, and I sat up front, and and the pilot sat in back, and he flew the airplane, and I shot the weapons.
How many live missions did you do while you were over in Vietnam?
many. I have over 600 combat hours
Wow.
in flight.
Wow.
Have 22 air medals.
I'm assuming then you flew all over the place while you were in Vietnam?
All over 3 Corps and 4 Corps. I never got up north to the I Corps and 2nd Corps.
Yeah. So, what were some of the missions that you were on? What do you remember? What was your target areas?
Our unit was a air cavalry unit, and our job was to go out and find the enemy, and then pin the enemy down, bring troops in to surround the enemy, destroy the enemy, and then pull our troops out. So we had UH-1Hs that would haul the troops. We had AH-1G Cobras that were the gunships, and we had the OH-6, which was the scout helicopter. They flew very close to the ground, and they would get enemy fire. They would mark with smoke, and then the guns, who is up at altitude, would come in and shoot at the target. When they got the target engaged, then the troops would be brought in the UH-1 helicopters, 8 in each bird, and then they would land, and they would go in and contact the enemy.
Yeah. How high did you fly to
Well-
try to find where the enemy was located?
Well, the OH-6s flew at treetop level, and low and slow. But to draw fire and to see very detailed stuff. And then, of course, the Cobras and the command ship stayed above 1,500 feet, and that was out of range of small arms fire. So it was relatively safe. But then we would go in when the action started and join the combat.
How often on the missions that you found the enemy? Was it most of the time?
I would say probably 3 out of 5 times that we went out, we would find some enemy.
Yeah.
You'd have to understand they were very small units in the south. They were infiltrating there. We did not have the North Vietnamese Army, which was, battalions and that sort of thing. We would usually have like platoon and company size units. But we would find them moving, and of course, when they were moving, they were open targets.
Yeah. Did you do any escapades over the border into Cambodia?
We actually flew into Cambodia inadvertently sometimes. In fact, I got mortared out of some disputed land between Vietnam and Cambodia. I got mortared out 5 times trying to rescue an aircraft, trying to pull an aircraft out.
So no true missions over the border, just
No
in
missions.
areas
We were
that
not
you were
allowed
on.
to go in.
Yeah.
That's true.
Are there any interesting stories while you were flying in combat that you remember that stick out that you might want to tell people about?
Well, one time we caught a company-sized element in the open. They usually hide in the daytime, but we were out very early and we spotted them. And we brought in, we engaged them, and then we brought in Air Force aircraft to do some bombing. And we basically annihilated the whole unit. Many times, though, we engaged small units, a platoon or so, and those were very exciting. And we received a lot of fire, but I was never shot down or never personally injured in all my flying.
Was your helicopter ever damaged enough to have to go down early or anything like that?
Oh yeah, many times you'd have to, maybe it was still flyable, but it wasn't safe to fly for a long time. And of course, as a maintenance officer, one of my job is when an aircraft got shot down, was to go out and repair it on site or evacuate it, either by lifting it out myself, like the OH-6, I would take a Huey and I would lift an OH-6 and take it back to the base. If it was a Huey or a Cobra, I'd have to call in a Chinook, and we would rig them. They would pick them up, and then they would take them back into our base.
So
But we did a lot of combat damage stuff.
probably not only to your vehicle, but others?
Oh
in
yeah,
the air?
to the whole unit. I had 27 helicopters that I was responsible for maintaining and combat repair.
So every time you went out on a mission, you had your job full, coming back and diagnosing and figuring out what was wrong with everything that had been damaged.
Most days when the aircraft came back in from the area of operations, there would be some combat damage. I'd say probably only about once every 10 days or so we'd have to go and airlift
Yeah.
one of the helicopters back.
Was it, were they generally small things that could be repaired within a couple of days, or little of both, some things that took a while?
Many things we could do because we had a lot of capability in the unit I was in. But in some cases, we'd have to order a whole tail boom, or we'd have to, do major work on the aircraft. But
Yeah.
most of them was repaired within 4 or 5 days and
Yeah.
back into combat.
Did you enjoy that a lot?
Yes, I did. It was a very productive job. I enjoyed it. And of course, people that are involved in mission work, the troops are happy when they're doing that. And my mechanics were very skilled, and they worked hard, and they were. We did a great job.
Yeah. I'm assuming that you went on missions where you had pretty active ground troops, ground forces close by wherever you were, so they could get there quick if you needed them.
What we did is we were in 5th Corps, and we worked with the South Vietnamese Army. So the combat troops, the infantry troops that we lifted in, was the Vietnamese. So we would fly into their base, we'd pick them up, and then we would stage in an area to be ready for the action in the area of operations.
So joint mission between the United States Army and the South Vietnamese Army,
Absolutely.
as far as their ground forces.
Absolutely.
And that was pretty constant while you were over there?
The whole time, yeah. And most of the operations in the Delta were in cooperation with them. And of course, their command in there controlled the targets that you shot and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. So you were doing this for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months? How long were you,
12 months,
all the time you were there, that's pretty much what you were doing then?
and we did it every day.
Wow.
Of course, I did have a short break. In fact, I had an emergency leave to come home and for 10 days, and then I had a 4-day R&R that time.
And what base were you stationed at when you were primarily doing this?
I was in Vinh Long.
Okay.
It was just an established Army airfield.
The entire 12 months, that's where you were
Yes.
stationed out of?
Of course, I traveled to many others because in the maintenance business, you're always going looking for parts or looking for something or delivering stuff. So
Yeah.
I was all over. From Saigon, pretty much south to
Yeah.
the sea.
Yeah. So what units were you with then? What were you assigned to?
I was with the 7th of the 1st Air Cavalry Regiment. And it's a separate squadron that had, like I say, it had 4 troops in it. It had headquarters, it had Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta. And I was Charlie Troop, and I was the maintenance effort for it. So we had over 100 aircraft in the squadron, and probably about 800 people.
Yeah. That's, so were you pretty prepared when you came out of flight school and all the other to diagnose and work on the aircraft as needed in the air?
More prepared than I thought I was. Actually, they did a very good job of teaching you how to troubleshoot and how to do things. And it was a matter of methodically going through it. So I learned a lot. I learned a lot about test flying, learned how to diagnose problems, and it was a very rewarding
Yeah.
sort of thing.
So did you do tests? I mean, the test flying, that with a damaged aircraft?
Well-
Or were you test flying new arrivals as well?
Many times we'd go out to the AO and an aircraft would have pretty significant damage. Well, I'd make an evaluation of whether I wanted to fly it back and take the chance that it wouldn't make it, or I needed to evacuate it. So I flew many aircraft back that were pretty much damaged. And then, of course, some of them we didn't fly back.
Yeah.
And it was just a decision you made at the time.
Did you make any wrong decisions of flying something back you probably shouldn't have?
I probably did, but I got back. So the Lord was with me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Sounds like your decisions were pretty good, thorough.
Well, the good news is I never broke an airplane, and I never was shot down. Now I've had some emergency landings,
Yeah.
hydraulics go out, that sort of thing, but never had a crash landing.
Yeah.
So,
For as many flights as you were on, that's a pretty amazing record in itself.
well, it's a good record if you haven't been a helicopter. That's
Yes.
true.
Yeah, very good record. So, I assume that you knew when your exit of Vietnam was going to be long before it arrived.
Yes.
What was that process like, leaving Vietnam?
Well, the last month everybody got nervous and got anxious. There was a mixed feeling. You hated to leave the unit. You had things going. You had friends there, but you were also very anxious to get home to see family. And so, when you left, it was kind of a sad day, but you were certainly glad to get home.
Yeah, yeah. Where did you go to when you left? Did you fly directly back to the States, or?
Flew back to the States, and my family was in Ventura, California, where I left them near family. So I flew back there, and then once I was there, I was assigned to go to Fort Hood, Texas. So
Okay.
I took my family and we moved to Fort Hood, Texas.
Did you have children in Ventura as well?
I had 3 children when I was in Ventura before I went in, and while I was on active duty, we had our last child, a daughter, at Fort Walters, Texas.
Okay.
And and of course, when I was in Vietnam, the baby actually had a spinal meningitis, and I was called home. Well, by the time I got home, she was okay, and then I stayed for 10 days and went back. But I had my children with me, and I took my family everywhere I went that I could. So
Did they have a rough time while you were away in Vietnam that year?
I think that this is one thing that people never think about, is the trouble and the times, the stress that the family goes through. And of course, there's no father there.
Right.
The children are being raised. The mother is under a lot of stress and worries every day. And of course, the only communication was a letter, which you wrote it, and 10 days later it would arrive.
Yeah.
And it was the same way. And I wrote a letter every day, and I received a letter every day, basically, while I was there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot different than communications today.
Yes.
You know, people just waited for mail call and things like that, and writing letters, and hopefully they'd make it through.
Right.
But so your active duty, combat zone duty, is done. Now after that you went to Fort Hood and then Fort Watton, Texas.
Well, I went to Fort Hood, and I served there in an aviation, or in a corps level support brigade, and I commanded the 528 Aircraft Maintenance Company, which was a general support aircraft maintenance company, and we could do basically most things that you could do at the factory as far as repair of helicopters. And we were at Fort Hood for a purpose of supporting Project Master, which was a high-level organization that was testing and developing systems for the Army. And one of the things in my unit, I had a special unit that was very secret, and what we did is we were testing night vision systems, the things that we see now, the things they use now, that you simply turn your head and you can look and see at night, or the night vision goggles,
Right.
those sort of things. We developed that, or Project Master developed that, and my unit was supporting the aircraft that they would use to experiment that with. So it was very, very exciting, very high-level stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And how long were you associated with the 528th Aircraft Maintenance Company?
For about 2 years.
Okay.
And from there, I went on to go back to school and went to Europe.
Where was school at?
School was at Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Okay.
It was a career course. And at the time, I did not have a college degree. So when I finished the career course, the Army sent me to Tampa University in Tampa, Florida for about a year and a half. And I got a business degree in business administration. I then moved to Fort Rucker and served in an operational status. I was the flight operations officer for Fort Hood. For Fort Rucker. And I was in charge of all the airfields, the operation of all the airfields, and all the stage fields and flight areas and restricted areas. And while at Fort Rucker, I had a couple of special assignments. One was I did the install locks on all the Army aircraft, or developed the system to do that, and the drawings and whatever that was able to secure Army aircraft.
Could you tell me a little bit about that? How did you get in, or how were you put in charge of finding and trying to come up with locks for the helicopters?
Well, I was in my office one day, and my boss came in and says, "Captain Smith, get your hat." So I got my hat. He takes me, we get in the vehicle, and he drives me out to the Army airfield. And he says, "See, every aircraft the Army owns is on this airfield. I want you to develop a locking system for those aircraft, and I want it done as soon as possible." And he gave me units that civilians and military that would do what I asked them to do. And I started on a Thursday and worked nonstop till the following Tuesday. On that Tuesday, I flew 3 of the 7 aircraft that I developed locks for into the parade ground at the headquarters, and General Maddox, the Major General who was in charge of the Aviation Center, came out, looked at them, approved them, and very shortly AVSCOM was wanting my designs and so on and so forth. And needless to say, they were implemented worldwide within just a matter of weeks.
Well, that's something to be very proud of.
Yeah, it was a good project. And I do have a lot of pride in it.
Is that
Now, I was just at the right place at the wrong time, I guess, is how you could put that I happened to get that job. And I had no qualification for it, although I was an aircraft maintenance officer, so I knew.
Yeah. Is that lock still used in some fashion today?
On the aircraft that were existing, the UH-1, the OH-6, the OH-58, and most of the older aircraft, they're still using the same locking systems.
Wow.
Of course, the Apache and the Black Hawk came along later, and they installed those at the factory.
Yeah, that's a pretty neat story. What other special assignment did you say you were put on
Well,
while you were there?
after I got back from Europe, I served. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Europe. I went to Europe and served in the 3rd Armored Division in Frankfurt, Germany. It was part of 5th Corps, and at the time I was Security Plans and Operation Officer, and one of my jobs was rear area security for the division, and actually for the whole Corps. So I looked at our security plan, rear area security plan, and it had not been touched in over 8 years. So if you looked at it and you tried to follow it, you couldn't even find the places on the map that it called for. Anyway, I put a group together, a captain, intelligence captain, and a military police sergeant, and 4 or 5 other people, and we developed an entire rear area support plan for the Corps. It was sent back to the Pentagon, and it was used as a model for all rear security plans.
Wow.
And that was a nice thing to have done.
Yeah. And then from there you returned back to the States.
I came back to the States, and I went to the Armed Forces Staff College, which is a Commanding General Staff College level.
Where was that
Norfolk.
located at?
It's at Norfolk,
okay.
Virginia. And it has all the services in it. And when I left there, I was assigned as a U.S. Army plant representative, which is someone who looks in military or in plants that are producing military equipment and ensures that the specifications, etc., are being followed. And I was assigned to Arizona, and I went to Yuma, Arizona, to develop the final developmental testing on the Apache aircraft. I was there for a year and a half, and then I moved to Mesa, where the plant was for the Apache, and I was the plant representative there, and I accepted the first Apache aircraft
Wow.
that came out. And that was another good job.
Yeah. So how long were you working in plant then?
And the plant, I was in the
Or with
plant
it.
about 2 years. Then industry came and met me, and they said, we would like to have you work on a special project, but you have to retire from the Army, go to work for us. So I retired from the Army, and about 6 weeks later, I was ready to go to work for Bell Helicopter Company to develop a Scout helicopter that is called LH Tech, light helicopter that the Army was developing. This helicopter had a lot of requirements for it, and it eventually was canceled because they couldn't keep within the specified lightweight and range and carry all the weapons that the Army wanted on it. So
Required.
it was eventually canceled.
Yeah. So, are there any other stories, or when you left the Army, when you were discharged, were there any feelings one way or the other about going into private industry, or was the time ready for you to move on?
Well, I made the decision to retire and go to work for Bell Helicopter because I had promised my wife that I would not drag her to the Pentagon or to high profile. She was a wonderful wife, raised our children, did a fine job, but she did not necessarily want to be the colonel's wife
Yeah.
or the general's wife. So I promised her that when I got my time in, that I would retire. Well, the opportunity came up for me to go to work for Bell Helicopter, so I said, I'll do it. When I make a decision, right or wrong, I live with that decision.
Yeah.
And I didn't look back.
Yeah.
Now, the job that I had with Bell, I eventually did not take, even though they hired me. I instead went to work for Allied Signal in Phoenix. The reason is I didn't want to travel to Fort Hood, Texas, or to Fort Worth, Texas, where they wanted me to go.
Interesting. What rank did you retire at?
Lieutenant Colonel,
Okay. And what year did you retire?
1986.
And from there, how long did you continue working with the aircraft industry then?
Well, when I didn't take the job with Bell, I looked for a job in the Phoenix area, and I got a job with Allied Signal, which is the old Garrett Corporation that made APUs and aircraft engines, light engines, and so on and so forth. They had developed an afterburning engine for jet aircraft, which they sold to Taiwan. Well, Taiwan, the Chinese Air Force, they bought the engines, but when they started to produce them, they said, well, we want you to develop all the logistics support for those. So my job, they hired me to do the logistics support development.
Uh-huh.
So I spent 11 years working on that project. Did everything from the, the training manuals to the spare parts, every part of it, all the training, everything, special tools and everything. In 11 years, I traveled to Taiwan 38 times.
Wow.
And so I spent a lot of time there.
Yeah.
But I finished that job, excuse me, in 11 years, and so happened that Allied Signal came around and offered golden handshakes if people wanted to retire, and I took a gold handshake, and then I retired in 1998. Actually, almost 1999.
Yeah, sounds good. You mentioned earlier the dedicated service that your entire family had given to the United States. Could you tell me a little bit about your family's service overall
Sure.
for the military?
My my family went where I went when I was in the States, any place that we go, and they went with me to Germany, and we lived usually in military housing if we could, or we lived where we could. It's real funny. You drag your family around, and it's a real imposition. You move them from their friends, their schools, their
Yeah.
happy environment, and someplace else. And several years after I did this, I was talking to my kids about, well, I dragged you around here and there, and they said, oh no, that was fine, because they learned a lot, they adapted well, and it made them better adults. Now, the bad part, I feel, is the family sacrifices for the husband's career, for the father's career. And I think they made a big sacrifice, and it was fine.
Yeah.
They didn't mind doing it, but it was a big sacrifice for them.
Some negatives and some positives there, yes.
Absolutely.
You mentioned also that your brothers all served. Could you tell a little bit about their service and how remarkable it is for your entire family?
Sure. I was the seventh boy in the family. My oldest brother, Sammy, served in the U.S. Army in 1942 through 45, and he was in the Army in the infantry in Europe. The second brother was a CB, and he served in the CBs doing construction projects, airfields, houses, housing areas, hangars, that sort of thing. And he was in the South Pacific through 1945. The next brother, Lewis, was a merchant marine, and of course the merchant marines were under the military during that time because what they were hauling was military gear.
Right.
And he served both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and many times. And of course, those ships went unescorted and were in grave danger most of the time. But he served there and came out okay. My next brother was in the Army, and he served in Europe for 2 years at the end of the war. My next brother was Walter, served in Korea, and he served about 15 months in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
My next brother, Beecher, the one just older than me, he served in the U.S. Marines, and he was in Korea for a year and a half. And then I served in Vietnam.
You were the youngest of the brothers.
Yes.
All the brothers. And so that's pretty amazing, all 8 of you in military service.
Well, not only that, I had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Both sons and both son-in-laws in my family served in the military. Unfortunately, they all served in the Air Force. But
Good. As we wind up, is there anything that, how has your service to your country, have you benefited from that since you left the Army? Any way that you feel that even today that you're gaining benefits or
Absolutely.
from your time serving?
Absolutely. No, I feel that, first of all, I think the Army taught me a lot. I always tell people the Army did more for me than I did for the Army. But they trained me in many things. I became a logistician, a certified professional logistician,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very high. There were only, at the time, there were only 2,000 of them in the world when I became a certified professional logistician. That was a job, or that was a training that led to me getting the civilian jobs that, even though they were military
Yeah.
oriented or related, but they gave me a lot of good training,
Yeah.
and they took good care of me. They've provided every month for my living since the time I retired.
Yeah. Just one last question. If you, and it sounds like you've got 4 children of your own, and I'm assuming grandchildren and beyond, and your family has pretty much lived up to what you, as an example from you, of service. You know, your sons and your son-in-laws, and I'm sure, as you said, your wives, or your daughters, I'm sure they're all part of that, because the service really encompasses the entire family. Is there any stories that you could tell, even great-grandchildren that are unborn, about what you think of as far as serving in the United States military, about service?
Well, I'm very proud of the fact that I was very patriotic. Excuse me. I'm very loyal, and I upheld the principles of our country to a fullest degree. I did not mind going and serving in wartime to defend the country, and I think it was a privilege, and I certainly think it's also an obligation that we have. But I gained a whole lot from being in the military, and the military was very good to me. They're very demanding. They demand a lot of your families, and you don't get to go where you want to, when you want to, and of course they pay you 24 hours a day, so you don't ever have to go home. You can work 24 hours a day. But it was a great time, and I feel very proud of that, and I appreciate it very much when anyone says thank you for your service, because even though I wasn't a hero, I felt like that I did a good service for the country, and I am proud of that.
Well, I think you're a hero. Thank you for your service, Jimmy, and thank you for having the interview
Sure.
today.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jim.